Okay, well, I guess it's 11:15 now, so there seem to be quite a few of you on the call. So we can get started and maybe more people will join as we go through. So thanks for being here, everyone, today. So this talk today is going to be just an overview of the type of careers that the Meteorological Service of Canada has on offer for new meteorologists. So I'm going to go through to start a quick presentation, just about 30 minutes long, that will kind of give you an overview of what we do for recruitment, what our training program looks like for new employees, and then the types of jobs you can occupy once you're hired by the MSC as a meteorologist, because there's lots of different opportunities in our organization for people with your backgrounds in atmospheric science. But just before we get into the presentation, I figured maybe it would be a good idea to tell you a bit about myself as well. So my name is Mariette Kulin. I'm a senior meteorologist with our training and career development division within the MSC. And in my current position, I lead the recruitment file nationally for all new meteorologists across the country. I'm originally from Montreal, but I've been living in Edmonton, Alberta since about 2007 when I was first hired. So my background, I was a bit in your position once upon a time, studying atmospheric science at McGill. Applied to the annual recruitment process that the MSC has each year for meteorologists and ended up getting hired that year. And it's been, I think, a really great career so far for me. I spent the majority of my career, about 12 or 13 years. I worked as an operational forecaster, where I specialized in producing aviation type forecasts. But lots of different career opportunities come available, and that's how I got my foot in the door in recruitment now. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and share my screen, and then maybe Aries, once it's up online, you can just give me a confirmation that you can see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
Excellent. Okay. Just move some things over just on my laptop here, so bear with me. Okay, so like I said, we're going to give an overview to start about the type of careers we have available and how you can apply to our recruitment process. Okay, so the MSC, what are we? So we're actually a division of the federal government department called Environment and Climate Change Canada. There's lots of different private industries and even provincial entities in Canada that will issue weather forecasts. However, we're the only ones who are allowed to issue the official weather warnings in Canada. Our staff work not just on science of the atmosphere, so the weather, but we also have scientists in-house working on things about the hydrosphere, so looking at lakes and rivers, as well as the cryosphere for snow and ice. So we're not just the weather necessarily. So why work for the MSC? Like I said, there's lots of different career opportunities available once you've got your foot in the door. So all our forecasters, they start out in operational forecasting. So different programs are a public program, aviation program. We actually have an ICE program, which is kind of unique to Canada, given where we are geographically. And we also contract services out to the Canadian military. Beyond operational forecasting, later on in your career, you can get involved in things like research and development with our services group, training like me, air quality, climatology, lots of different areas. Some of the other perks, I think, are the salary. So I can go through some of the new pay tables later on, but we did recently just sign a new contract, so pay rates have gone up. I think I'll pull up the exact numbers at the end of the presentation, but I think you'd start around $70,000 as an MT1 currently. The benefits, I think, are quite good. So compared with the private sector, government employees have access to the excellent Government Canada pension. So it's defined benefit versus defined contribution. So it's a little rare nowadays to get this kind of pension, but really strong benefit for people working for the government. Although note about job security is that when you start out as a meteorologist with Environment Canada, you're on a probationary period for the first 3 years while you're sort of starting through our training program. Especially during the first 8 months of your career, when you're in a classroom environment, learning how to apply your knowledge of meteorology, there's a lot of evaluations that take place, a lot of tests, there's a lot of information that's delivered in a really rapid way, and a lot of skills that you have to develop pretty quickly. So from time to time, we do end up having to release some people, unfortunately, who start out on our training program. However, Once the 3 years of the training program is completed, the normal job security of most Government of Canada jobs kicks in at that point. And like I say, there's lots of different advancement opportunities once you've got your foot in the door. So to just briefly touch on a few of our different career paths. So like I said, everyone starts out as an operational meteorologist, but later on you can get involved in different sections within the department. So looking at operational meteorology, there's 4 forecast programs. So basically 4 different specialities that operational forecasters can get involved in at the beginning of their careers. So the first one is our storm prediction centers. So those are ones that you probably think of the most when you think about a meteorologist, a government meteorologist. They're the ones issuing like the daily max min temperatures. They're the ones issuing the watches and warnings, that kind of thing. So there's lots of different offices for those, about 1 in almost every province. We also have meteorologists specializing in aviation forecasting. So that's like my background in our aviation centers called CMAX in Montreal, Quebec, and Edmonton, Alberta. We've got, like I mentioned, our ice services group, which does forecasting of like the thickness and movement of ice in our territorial lakes and oceans, important for basically marine navigation. So they're located in Ottawa. And then we've got our aviation and defense weather services groups. Most of them are found in Gagetown, New Brunswick. However, there's some smaller satellite offices in Halifax and Esquimalt. So I'll briefly touch on the main 3 where new meteorologists often find themselves, starting out with those SPCs. Sorry, was there a question I heard? No? Okay. So the SPCs, these are the locations where they are. Their role, like I said, is communicating high impact weather and controlling basically our public marine and air quality forecast programs. They're the ones issuing all the alerts for weather. They do some communication with the media as well as with emergency prevention services and the public. And the types of things they're forecasting are precipitation, cloud cover, temperature, wind speed and direction, that kind of thing. So you'll see in the images, some of you might have already the Weather Can app, which is where you can find all these official forecasts issued by our meteorologists at the SPCs. Bottom right corner of the slide, you can see a hurricane track map. So interestingly, our SPC in Halifax is also the Canadian Hurricane Center, where anytime there's sort of an extratropical storm coming up from the United States, they're the ones who take over from the Hurricane Center in the United States. Okay, still on operational meteorology, the other program that you can get involved with is aviation. So our Canadian Meteorological Aviation Centers, there's only 2 offices. So Montreal handles the eastern half of the country's aerospace, and Edmonton handles the western half and most of the Arctic. So their role is basically forecasting all the weather for Canada's aviation network. So there's over 200 airports across Canada, hard to believe, but it's especially important in the north, in Arctic communities where there's perhaps no road access in or out. So lots of small airports and landing strips up there, and dispersed across the country as well. It's more than just the normal ones that we tend to fly out of. So their main role is to communicate the weather risk to maintain the safety of the air navigation system. So the types of things they're forecasting are turbulence, convection, icing, occasionally from time to time volcanic ash. Usually that's more a volcano erupting in Alaska or Iceland than one necessarily erupting in Canada, but the ash moves into our airspace, as well as winds on runways and low ceilings and visibilities on runways as well. 2 main types of forecasts they issue. One is this text sort of coded forecast. So it's called a terminal aerodrome forecast, or TAF. Basically what this is any pilot around the world can read this code, whether they speak Italian, French, German, whatever. They'll be able to read this code and determine what the forecast landing conditions are at that airport. Another type of forecast they produce is graphical forecasts, so graphical forecast areas, or GFAs. So you can see the panels here. The top one is what we call the clouds and weather forecast in Ontario, and the bottom one is the icing and turbulence hazards. Okay, another one I'll briefly mention for operational meteorologists are our aviation defense weather services groups. So like I said, the main office is in New Brunswick on the military base in Gagetown. However, we do have 2 smaller satellite offices for the naval fleets in Esquimalt on Vancouver Island and in Halifax in Nova Scotia. So they're the meteorologists who work for ADS, for our aviation defense weather services. Their geographic forecast area can be really anywhere around the globe where our Canadian Armed Forces are deployed. They perform a mixture of aviation, marine, and public type forecasts. So it's really a mixed bag of the different types of products they're going to be issuing. All our meteorologists, all the ones who are employed by the MSC, they technically work for Environment and Climate Change Canada. And the meteorologists here are just on contract out to the Department of National Defense to provide their services. Another thing to mention is that all meteorologists require a security clearance, but typically it's just the lowest level security clearance in the government, which is called reliability. But if you get posted to work on these offices, since you're going to be on a military base, you require a secret clearance. Okay, beyond operational meteorology, though, like I said, meteorologists later on in their careers can get involved in a lot of different areas, one of which is with our services groups. So you may have seen on television or heard on the radio or seen written about in a news article, one of our warning preparedness meteorologists or WPMs. They're the ones who are typically the ones interacting with the news media and providing some information. They're located across the country, typically in every office where there's a storm prediction center. You also have services group meteorologists. They provide decision support services to our major clients. So oftentimes that's provincial emergency management or even federal emergency management groups, as well as the media. They're also the ones historically who have gone out into the field to do damage site investigations following a severe event, although recently the Northern Tornadoes Project has been helping us out with that as well. And their main role is really just to communicate the risk of various weather predictions to our. Another role you can get involved in later on in your career, once you're hired by the MSC, is with research and development. So obviously we want to keep abreast of all new advancements in the field and continually improve our numerical weather prediction models, things like that. So the meteorologists for R&D, they'll work on developing these models, things like post-processing of the models, developing new algorithms, and as well they're involved heavily in producing new forecasting tools for other operational meteorologists working the desk. So yeah, a lot of them are located in Dorval, Quebec at our Canadian Meteorological Centre there, but a few are dispersed across the country as well. Okay, but how to become a meteorologist, basically probably why you're all here today. So there's two different education requirements we have. The first one is your degree. So all of you at York, typically what we would accept for a degree is, I think it's called the 4-year honors in atmospheric science. It's not the 3-year degree, but the full 4-year degree in atmospheric science. Or if you've got a Bachelor of Science in, let's say, math or physics already, and then go on and take the 1-year certificate program in meteorology offered by York. So either of those would meet our degree requirements. Beyond the degree, though, we do have separate specific course requirements. This is where things get a little bit more specific. So the course requirements, basically, in total, it comes out to 10 courses in physics and math. So that can encompass anything, even like statistics courses, because it's a national recruitment strategy. I know some universities have a separate department of statistics outside the Department of Mathematics. I can't quite remember if that's the case for York or not, but because some universities combine statistics in with the math department, the statistics course will count towards this as well. We also require at least one dynamic meteorology course. At York, typically that's Dynamics 1 and 2. We require a thermodynamic meteorology course, that's that ECCC 3030 offered by York, and at least one synoptic meteorology course, and typically that's synoptic 1 and 2 at York as well. On top of those, we require 3 other meteorology-related courses. Quick note here about the dynamic and synoptic courses, since York divides them into 2 different courses in terms of Dynamics 1 and Dynamics 2, and Synoptic 1 and Synoptic 2. Technically, to apply, you would really technically only need to take Synoptics 1 and Dynamics 1, but I'll get into it a little bit further in the presentation. But as part of the assessment, you're going to be assessed for your knowledge of meteorological theory, and some of that will encompass the knowledge taught in Synoptics 2 and Dynamics 2. So just to keep that in mind, you want to make sure you grab all 4 of those courses. Some conditions of employment. So meteorology is a bit unique in that we do have interesting conditions of employment, one of which is shift work. So the weather happens 24/7, and so meteorologists kind of have to be working as well 24/7 in order to make sure the public is aware of any hazards that are coming. So all our meteorologists are going to be working day shifts, night shifts, sometimes weekends, sometimes holidays, that kind of thing. Depending on the office, The typical shifts typically will start at 7 a.m., go to 7 p.m. for a day shift, or start at 7 p.m. and go to 7 a.m. for a night shift, that kind of thing. And the rotation, it's a bit different across the country depending on what office you're in and what program as well. But you usually end up with 3 or 4 days, sometimes off in between your cycle of shifts. So we'll try and group them typically so that you're working a bunch of nights and then a longer time off and then a bunch of days for time off. Or some offices will group the nights and the days together and then an even longer stretch between. Another condition is your presence is required at the working desk for the entire shift. So what this means is it's not like you can't get up and go grab your lunch from the lunchroom or use the bathroom or anything like that. It's more just to say you can't just get in your car and drive away for half an hour and come back later. You have to maintain a weather watch throughout the whole shift. Mobility is the one we get the most questions about often from students. So the first 5 years of your career, what's called a mobility clause will apply. So some people view this maybe as a bit of a negative. Some people view it as a positive. I can see it both ways. Basically, why it exists is because within the MSC, our current staff, our current meteorologists, they're going to be retiring at different rates across the country. So sometimes one year there'll be a staff shortage in Toronto, other years there might be a staff shortage in Winnipeg. We want to make sure that we have sufficient staff numbers at every office to ensure that the forecasts are able to go out properly and that people aren't working overtime or anything like that. So that's why this clause exists, in order to move people around the country and ensure that there's a sufficient quota of meteorologists at each office. So typically in the first 5 years of your career, you might end up in one location, and then by the end of your career, you might end up in another. The way it works is once you get hired, you're on our classroom training course and you'll get sent a mobility survey where you get to list your preference of all the forecast offices in Canada. And then a management group will get together and try and slot people in based on their preference, but also based on the organizational need. So for example, if you really, let's say, really want to work in Vancouver right away in your career, it's a very small office. You might not get there your first, second, third, fourth year. You will eventually get there. It just might take a few years. So just to keep that in mind when you're applying. Something else to mention is that the process for recruitment is open to anyone currently in Canada at the time of application, as well as any citizens residing abroad. Within that, though, there is some preference categories that are given to certain candidates. So if you're a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, you get priority over everyone else. And then priority goes to Canadian citizens and permanent residents. So if you're in Canada on a work visa or a student visa, you can still apply, and I would encourage you to apply. It's just preference is given to everyone else ahead of you for eventual job offers. Brief touch on diversity, employment equity, and assessment accommodation. This is a key priority for our government department and Environment Canada. So there's 4 employment equity groups: women, persons with disabilities, Aboriginal Indigenous peoples, as well as visible minorities. We want to make sure our recruitment strategies are fair and accessible to all of these groups. So if you belong to any of those groups, I'd highly encourage you to self-declare on your application. There'll be a box for that when you apply. As well, if you require an accommodation, let's say you get invited to an assessment, you can get invited to our exam of meteorological knowledge or to an interview, and you think you might need an accommodation measure, please let us know in advance and we'll be able to set that up for you. So some examples of common accommodation measures are ensuring that an assessment takes place in a wheelchair accessible environment, something like that. Okay, so the application process. So the poster is currently online. If any of you don't have the link, let me know in the Q&A session and I'll try and put it in the chat window here. It came online on January 2nd and it's available until January 29th. So if you're planning on applying, make sure you get the application submitted by January 29th. If you are screened in, if you meet all the education requirements, then you'll be invited to take an online oral exam at some point in February. If you pass that exam, you'll then move on to the interview stage in March or April. And then if you pass the interview, then you'll be considered to be part of our qualified pool of candidates. And we'll be sending out job offers likely in summer coming up. Usually those go out in June, last few years. And then the start date basically for employment would be likely mid-September in either Montreal if you are able to speak French, or in Edmonton. So that's for our classroom training. And Eric, I see you've got your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering about the online oral exam. What does that entail? Like, is that what would be required to do in the
Yeah.
oral exam?
So I'll get into it a little bit more further on in the presentation, but what I can tell you is it's going to be assessing your knowledge of meteorological theory. And what that encompasses is your knowledge from synoptics 1 and 2, your knowledge from dynamics 1 and 2, and your knowledge from your thermodynamic course at York. So really anything in those 3 courses is up for grabs in the exam. The format is we use this tool called BidCruiter, which is used actually across the government of Canada nowadays ever since the pandemic. We've kind of gotten away from in-person exams and moved more to this online option. So you'll receive a link to access the exam on this BidCruiter website for a specific date and time. On that date and time, you'll launch the link. And basically the way it works is it launches in a browser and it sort of uses your webcam and laptop microphone. And one by one, each of the questions will appear on your screen and you'll be given a certain amount of time to think about the question and then a certain amount of time to deliver your answer to the question orally before moving on to the next question. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of that before.
Yeah, so we started, well, we've been doing online oral exams basically since the pandemic. Last year was the first year we used BidCruiter. It worked pretty well. So we got pretty good feedback actually from the candidates about the ease of use, and there is 24/7 support for it. So hopefully it wouldn't happen, but if like your laptop suddenly shuts down mid-exam or something like that, it's very easy to just like reset things and allow you to still progress through the exam with a quick notification. Okay, we'll move on. So like I said, that application process, so it's an annual process. It does usually get posted online each year, either December, January, or February. So if you're not about to graduate this year and aren't looking to apply this year, but maybe next year or the year after, that would be the general time frame when our application process starts. And it is on our GC Jobs website. I've got the link here. This is the link just to the GC Jobs, not the actual job poster itself. A note here as well, if you aren't thinking of applying this year, but want to be alerted to when the process gets launched again, let's say for 2025 or 2026, it's a good idea, even right now, to just set up an account on this GC Jobs website. And you can then set up email alerts so you get notified next time positions for meteorologists open up to the public. Okay, so like I said, those 2 assessments. So starting off with that oral exam online, it's the knowledge of meteorological theory. I've got an image of a textbook here that I've found useful in the past. I'm pretty sure it's many editions past this image though by now. But really any textbook that you've used for your synoptic dynamic thermodynamic class could be a good study guide as well. I will say we're not going to get into so many details as like Holton's dynamics, like that's maybe a bit too math physics heavy, more general concepts. What I would highly recommend though is if you're going to be invited to the exam, please study beforehand. Lots of people form little study groups at their own universities beforehand for a week or 2 to sort of review some things and quiz each other. I'd highly recommend that if any of you want to get together and do that. It is important to study. It's not the type of exam that you could pass without any prep beforehand. If you pass that exam, then you're going to be invited to the interview stage. It's going to be assessing what we call our behavioral competencies. So can you work well with others, initiative, thinking, client focus, that kind of thing. We try to make it as stress-free as possible. So at the interview, it's going to be online. You're provided with a list of questions about 45 minutes in advance. You're given time to make notes about how you'd like to answer each question, and then you're invited to orally deliver answers to each question. So it's less on the spot, perhaps. Eric, go ahead.
Speaking of passing, is it like a 50% pass or is it 75, or what's the mark that we have to get to?
It varies year to year based on the average marks and how many people we're looking to hire. We might cut it off at, let's say, even higher if we have so many candidates that we don't want to have to interview 100 people. For just maybe, let's say, 20 or 30 positions, right? So it varies from year to year. Does that answer your question?
Yep. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, if you're hired, then you're basically hired onto what we call our Meteorologist Occupational Development Program, or MODP. We love our acronyms in the government. So the first part of this MODP is the MOIP, or MOIP course. So it's a classroom course. You're paid to sit in a classroom. So it's a classroom like you're at a university now, except you're being paid a salary to attend it. Basically, it's Monday to Friday, typically 8 to 4, 9 to 5, depending on what you guys vote on once you start the class for timing. It's offered in 2 locations. So if you have some ability in French, you'd be invited to take the course in Montreal, or in English, you'd be invited to take the course in Edmonton. There are some initial relocation expenses if you have to, let's say, move to Edmonton or Montreal, that the government will cover up to $5,000 to help you with that move. When you're hired, you're considered to be at the MT1 level, which is what we call a meteorologist intern. And this course lasts approximately 7 to 8 months. Midway through the course, like I said, you fill out a mobility survey, and you find out generally in February what office you're going to be deployed to at the end of the course. So typically in the spring, then you're going to get your deployments out following the course onto what we call our on-the-job training phase. So that's where you end up in a forecast office, whether it's a public office, an aviation office, a defense office. You're paired up with a more senior meteorologist operationally, and you're basically kind of just job shadowing, watching what the actual operational forecaster is doing, and gradually ramping up, taking on some responsibility yourself. There's a lot of evaluations, again, that take place during this time, typically lasts about 2 to 3 months. After that, you get a promotion with another salary bump increase up to the MT2 level. And you start what we call your developmental period. So here you're actually issuing forecasts. You're still under the supervision of a more experienced meteorologist, but you're responsible still for your own forecast, and you're expected to do the full workload of an operational forecaster. This period typically lasts 18 months for most people, at which point then you get promoted to the working level of a meteorologist, what we call the MT3 operational meteorologist level. At this point, you're at the working level. So you could stay in MT3 your entire career. If what you love the most is just issuing forecasts, then like MT3 is where it's at for you. If you're interested more in expanding beyond that, getting into sort of supervisory skills, management, other positions outside of operational forecasting, then you can apply on processes at that point, what we call competitions, to get promotions, like an MT5, MT6, MT7 level, that kind of thing. When you start out though, you're on our training course in the classrooms. Like I said, it's about 7 to 8 months long at the MT1 level. You do fill out that mobility survey midway through to determine, to let us know basically what preferences you have or where you eventually want to be deployed to. And you do fill out that mobility survey each year as well for those first 5 years. So if you don't get your preferred location year 1, you can ask for it again year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. And eventually in your career, you'll wind up where you want to be. One thing to note about hiring numbers, so our 2 classrooms, the number of desks available for hiring people, it's limited to 29, just based on the classroom size, divided between Edmonton and Montreal. And the number of hirings we do each year is really up to upper management approval. I will say, though, that the last 3 years, I would say, we've had more positions available than qualified applicants. The opposite of what it was like when I was in your position in university, when there were far more applicants than positions. Now there's far more positions available than applicants typically in the past. I'm not going to guarantee that again this year, but based on what we've seen so far, it's a good spot to be in if you're a student coming out of atmospheric science right now. Okay. So you may have noticed on the job poster, there's some information about what we call our R&D stream, our research and development stream. So this could be a good option for somebody who are really interested in, let's say, computer programming or different scientific projects. Maybe you're coming with a master's degree or even a doctorate, although that's pretty rare. Then that might be something you want to really target for your career, is getting involved in research and development. Like I said, all meteorologists have to start off in operational forecasting before they can move on to other areas. But with this R&D stream, what we're doing is we're selecting candidates right from recruitment so that while they're in our development program still, they can get some added sort of targeted mentorship in research and development, so that once they eventually do get a promotion to the MT3 level after 3 years, then they could sort of transition right away into a career in research and development and out of operational forecasting. So if this is something that interests you, make sure you just note it in your cover letter when you apply, and then we might ask for some extra information later on in the process if you pass your exam and interview. Another thing you might have noticed is our direct entry hiring at the MT2 and MT3 level. So most of you, I'm assuming, are still students. And because you're still students, you're not going to qualify for this entry stream. So this is really just for people who have some experience full-time working as an operational forecaster, whether that's in the private sector or perhaps for a provincial government entity and like fire weather forecasting sometimes, that's an option as well. So if you know anyone like that, let's say people who've already graduated, been working for a couple of years already, you can encourage them to apply for this MT2 and MT3 position. That way they sort of bypass our initial classroom training or part of our developmental period and can get hired right away at a bit higher salary. But for all of you on the call, if you're a student, then this is not going to be an option for you. Just make sure to apply for MT1 when you submit your application. And that's the overview of the MSc. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can kind of see you all again. And I'll just open it up to sort of questions if anyone has any. You've already started the application process or just based on the presentation I've given now. Feel free to ask. I'm here and available. I'm happy to answer. If you're too shy to ask on the call, I've got my email address there as well. So feel free to send me an email if you like as well. I'd be more than happy to respond that way. And maybe I had referenced the salary scales, and I know they just got updated. So I'm going to just double check what that is for you all, so I can actually give you the correct rates, because always good to know that rates have gone up.
There is a question in the chat.
But... Yeah, could you read it out for me?
I mean, it's not my question. I was just letting you know that there's a...
I'll find it on the chat here. 1 second. For the METs working with the Department of National Defense, what are the functional or operational differences between them and MET checks? Okay, so yeah, it's a really great question. So the Canadian Armed Forces, so enlisted members of the Canadian Armed Forces, some of them can get into what are called meteorological technician positions, and that's only for the Canadian Armed Forces. Environment Canada doesn't employ any meteorological technicians currently. They're basically people who maybe have like a high school diploma, enlist in the Canadian Armed Forces, and then get into this MET Tech training. So they're offered the training on the base in Winnipeg, and they start out as weather observers on various Canadian military bases. They might be up in Eureka, Resolute. They might be on ships as well with the Canadian Navy, taking weather observations. We also have meteorological technicians employed, again, by the Canadian Armed Forces, working alongside the Environment Canada meteorologists at like the Gagetown office, where they do aviation defense weather services. So they're sort of like briefer roles there. So again, not full meteorologists. They take the forecast being prepared typically by the Environment Canada meteorologist, and they're the ones who are best positioned to communicate that type of forecast to, let's say, the Canadian Armed Forces pilots, to be able to understand what the forecasts are looking like. So their main role really is as a communicator. They do a little bit of forecasting as well, but not to the level that our Environment Canada meteorologists do. And they all basically, if they are doing a little bit of forecasting, they have to be supervised at all times by a meteorologist from Environment Canada. So they do work side by side at the one office in Gagetown, but they are found elsewhere across Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces, mostly doing weather observation. I hope that answers that question.
Yes, thanks. That was my question. Just to follow up on that then, so during when you're in your training and stuff and they ask you where you want to go, it would be an option to specify that you would want to be working with DND as a operational MET then?
Yeah, if you want a public forecast role, then you can specify one of the public offices. If you want an aviation role, you can specify one of the aviation offices. And if you're really interested in national defense, then you can specify you want to get posted to Gagetown. I would say every year off our training course, because Gagetown is a large office, that's 1 or 2 meteorologists typically each year at least will be posted to Gagetown right off our classroom course.
All right, thanks.
No problem. And I did just pull up the new pay scales. So the MT1, so what you would start off at, the lowest rung is about $56,000, and then it goes to $74,000 a year. So his, well, sorry, no, that's that's going to be for 2025. Excuse me. So it actually starts at about 54,000 this year, up to 71,000. So typically, historically, MT1s, when they start the course, we pay them at the top of the MT1 scale, which would be about $71,000 a year. And then once you get up to the working level of meteorologist, the MT3, after about 3 years, you'd be looking at, by then it would be 2025, so you'd be looking at likely $93,000 or $96,000 a year, depending on if you have a master's degree or not. And then every year after that, you get a yearly increment. So guaranteed within 10 years, you'll be making $114,000 a year. Hopefully that wasn't too many numbers all at once. What would they look for specifically during the interview? Okay, so those competencies, I think there's 5 or 6 of them. So they're listed in the job poster as well. They are initiative, adaptability, working with others, client focus, communication, thinking, and demonstrating integrity and respect. Government Canada interviews are a bit different than most private sector interviews in my experience. Sometimes it can take people a bit by surprise if they're not expecting what the type of interview is. There are, I know at each university, they'll have like career counseling services. If you're looking for sort of assistance or tips for how to do a Government Canada interview, they could be a good resource to go to before the interview just to ask. As well as Google, I'm pretty sure Government Canada interviews online. There's various resources available there as well to sort of give you a guide on how they typically go and how best to prepare. You'll receive when an interview is scheduled, you'll receive an interview guide generally 2 weeks before your interview. And it will basically give you general definitions of each of the competencies we're going to be assessing, and it will describe the format of the interview. So the way it will work is there'll be a series of questions. The questions will either be behavioral questions or what we call experiential questions. So behavioral questions are the type of, tell us about a time when you dealt with this. Like explain the issue, explain how you handled it, explain how it resolved. The experiential questions are more, given this situation, how do you react and why? So those are the 2 types of questions you'll receive. And each question will be targeting 1 or 2 of the competencies. You'll want to answer it with those competencies in mind. If the question's about working with others, you'll want to highlight how well you worked with someone in that situation, right? As well, so as to like reduce the amount of stress, because I recognize interviews can be stressful. You're given the questions 40 or 45 minutes beforehand. So we'll share our screen with the list of questions, and you'll have some time to look through each question, think about an appropriate response, write some notes for yourself before you actually sort of start the interview and have to deliver your I'm not sure if I can, is there a question being asked? I'm sorry, it was difficult to understand. Did anyone else catch that question?
I think your mic was just on, but I have a question though.
Yeah.
I think I'm not sure, it's not clear for me from the poster. Are you creating a pool of applicants, or are you contacting each person directly kind of thing?
Okay, so once you apply, the first step will be I'll look through all the applications. You're going to be sending your transcripts, or sort of non-official transcripts if you're still in university, obviously, just the current course description or course listing that you've taken and the grades to me. I'll look through those. I'll look through what you're anticipated to get in terms of your degree, and then you'll get screened in. So if you meet all those education requirements for the degree and courses, or are about to meet them this semester, and you'll get screened into the first assessment. Then you'll get contacted for taking the exam. Everyone will be taking the exam usually on the same day. Usually going to be scheduled in late February. And then if you pass the exam, then you're invited to an interview. Again, you're sent an email beforehand with the dates. If you pass the exam and the interview, then technically you're considered to be part of our qualified pool of candidates, right? So everyone in the pool, then we do a ranking based on scores from the assessments, also taking into consideration the preference for people with experience as veterans, people who are Canadian citizens or permanent residents, above people who are here on a work visa or a student visa, that kind of thing. And then the individual scores from the assessments. Once that ranking is completed, then we look at how many positions are available, how many offers we'll be able to make for positions, and then begin sending out letters of offer. So letters of offer typically will go out in June, maybe July if there's a delay in the process, but we aim for June. And so you find out at that point if you've been accepted to start on our classroom training in September or not. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Is that what you were asking for?
Yeah, thanks. And I get just the follow-up then, quick follow-up. When are you expecting the emails to go out after the job posting closes?
Oh, so it depends how quickly I'm able to get through the screening. It's really just me looking through all the transcripts and diplomas. So typically we'll get between 90 and 150 applicants. It really depends on the year. So sometimes it will take a week, sometimes it will take 3 weeks. So really you'd be looking mid to late February basically to find out about the timing for the exam. And we try to give at least 1 week notice as well. Before the exam, but I would encourage you, if you want to start preparing and studying for the exam, you know it's coming up sometime in mid to late February, to go ahead and start doing that now.
And is it the same exam as like 10 years ago? It hasn't changed very much, or?
We change the exam every year, so it's not the same questions each year.
All right.
We do get repeat candidates as well, who they might not pass the exam the first year, so they'll take it again the next year. Like that's quite normal as well. So you want to make sure it's a different exam each year.
All right, thanks.
No problem. Shannon.
Thank you. Thank you for all the information. I just had a really quick question. So someone told me that if you get a job offer from Environment Canada, you have a year until you want to accept it. Is that true, or?
Okay, so yeah, so if you receive a job offer this summer, and let's say it turns out you've got something else lined up, you want to go to Europe for a year, go to Japan for a year, like that happens, right? Or you want to go on and pursue a master's degree in something, right? If you've qualified in our pool, you are in our pool for 5 years. So you can turn down the job offer, and then we'll come back to you the next year with an email saying you qualified. Are you interested in a position this year? We'll do that up to a maximum. Currently, the practice is for 5 years.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was asking then. So you are creating a pool then?
Yes, it's a pool.
Okay.
Anyone else?
I wrote a question in the chat.
Oh, let's check. For those who've completed postgraduate degrees in atmospheric science, is any preference given to them? Are they able to bypass a portion of the MT1 training? There is no preference given for postgraduate degrees. However, there is a bit of a salary bump, so a bit of an incentive still to get a master's degree. Basically, once you get to the MT2 or MT3 level, I'll just have to double check. Let me find the exact wording. Okay, so yeah, if you completed a master's degree in meteorology or equivalent degree like math or physics, you'll be paid not less than the salary in the 4th step. So while most MT2, so after the course is finished and that job shadowing period is finished and you get promoted to the MT2 level, if you've only got a bachelor's and diploma kind of situation, then you start generally at the 1st or 2nd increment of the MT2 level. Whereas if you've got a master's or PhD, you start at the 4th increment. So you start generally about $5,000 to $7,000 more a year if you've got a master's degree compared to everyone else in your cohort with just a bachelor's degree. But that's the only sort of advantage, I guess, to having a master's or PhD in our organization. It is by no means a requirement to go on and get a master's or PhD, and it doesn't really affect your ranking for a qualified candidate or likelihood of getting a job offer.
Thank you.
No problem. Did I miss any other questions? No. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, like I said, my email address was on that last slide, so feel free to email me if you ever have any questions. I'd be happy to answer, even if you're not planning on graduating this year, but I just want more information for future years, let's say, about how to apply. Like, feel free to email me at any point. I'd be happy to answer. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of your applications as well. Oh, someone's asking about the recording. Aris, did you want to answer that?